what I'll do in my opening presentation is do a quick assessment of the election results, talk about what's happening now and some of the dilemmas for the incumbent Prime Minister Netanyahu, and then look at some policy issues on the agenda and what we can maybe anticipate from the new government. So I'll start off with an assessment of the results themselves, and I'll make kind of two or three comments on that. The first is that, unlike perhaps some popular analysis that people may have read, there was no huge swing to the right. The country is broadly still split, almost 50-50, between the camp that supports Netanyahu and the camp that is anti-Netanyahu, that made up the last government. What really happened here was just that the right wing played better politics and were much better organized than the other flank. And that represented in a few ways. First of all, they unified their parties far better. They were able to sign off surplus vote agreements, which in the end added them an extra seat right at the end. And in contrast, the key issue this time that some people had predicted before was the issue of passing the threshold. And the two parties on the left, or on the anti-Netanyahu camp, Meretz and the Balad, which is a hardline Palestinian, pro-Palestinian, pan-Arabist party, both of them with close to 3% of the votes, kind of represented those 6 lost seats, around 300,000 votes in total, that went into the bin. And it was the margin of error so close to the 3.25 threshold. Meretz, for example, were about 4,000 seats below that threshold, which means they get nothing. So that kind of was the better politics of the right. The second aspect that the right did better was, instead of kind of work on the campaigns, because most of the country is pretty entrenched in their views, as you know, 5 elections in less than 4 years, there wasn't much movement between the blocs. But what Netanyahu's bloc did much better was target the vote in specific areas, which were more likely to be Likud supporting areas, and really kind of data-driven, focused on getting the votes out in those areas. We're talking about some of the towns in Sheva, in Ashdod, Kiryat Gat, places like this, where they'd lost votes, the people that were inclined to support Likud were then encouraged just to get out the vote. The other element of the bloc of the pro-Netanyahu is that, unlike in the past where Likud has looked to cannibalize some of the other parties on the right, they were quite happy and relaxed this time that Shas in particular and the religious Zionist party also took some of those votes. And as long as it went to the bloc, then that was okay with Netanyahu, and so it proved. A few words just on Ben Gvir and the religious Zionists, and we can talk at length about those, but I'll just make a couple of opening observations. First of all, let's put it into proportion of his support. 1 in 10 Israelis, or if you like, 9 in 10 of the Israeli voters did not vote for the religious Zionists. So again, we're not talking about a huge movement on the right, but still 1 in 10 is significant. If one compares it comparatively in other democracies that have also voted for hard right candidates and parties, the French had 40%, Le Pen had 40%. In Sweden and Italy now, we see hardline right-wing governments. And perhaps Trump is the best example of all of kind of the wave of populism. So Israel is not immune to that, and it's certainly part of that. And 1 in 10 voters kind of puts that into proportion. However, I would stress as well, and I wouldn't deny the fact, that there is something unique about the success of Itamar Ben Gvir. This is, to my record, this is well, not the first time, but the first time someone who has been convicted on charges of belonging to a terrorist organization and incitement to racism has been convicted in Israeli courts is now a member of the Knesset and potentially a minister, and as he is requested to be the next minister of public security, which is responsible for the police. A little bit of background again to just how extreme this is and kind of what a shift this is in Israeli politics. When his mentor, Meir Kahane, was briefly in the Knesset in the 1980s, the then leader of the Likud party, Menachem Begin, would leave the plenary when he spoke. Well, that was his disgust for having them in part of, even in the same chamber. Compared to that, fast forward 40 odd years later, and we can see the Likud leader is in cahoots and very close alliance with this party. Ben Gvir himself has gone on a little bit of a PR campaign just over the last couple of days. He wrote an op-ed in the Israeli Hayom newspaper calling out to his left-wing Israeli brothers, and saying he actually noted in his op-ed that the issue of capturing the car signal from Yitzhak Rabin's car back in '95, and famously until recently hanging a picture of the murderer Baruch Goldstein on his wall at home, and said that he's moderated and he's grown up and he's matured and he's not the same person. That's all well and good to say so, but we'll have to wait and see how much that is in practice. There's definitely a hope that the old Israeli adage of what you see from here is not what you see from there, i.e. the responsibility that it imbues, that you can be a reckless politician, but until you get into the ministerial chair and have responsibility, that's a sobering effect and a moderating effect. We'll wait and see exactly if that happens. Coming back to kind of where we are in the process right now, formally speaking, President Herzog will host all the faction leaders over the next 2 or 3 days, starting tomorrow morning. We'll meet all the factions. All of this will be broadcast live on the internet. There's kind of full transparency in this process of the consultation. And after a chat, basically, Herzog will ask them all who their recommendation is to be prime minister. Obviously, it will all go as anticipated. The right-wing bloc will endorse Netanyahu, and with 64 seats, that will be enough to give Netanyahu the mandate that will formally receive it and get from that moment 28 days to form the government, with the potential for 2 weeks extra to make an extension if he's struggling. Netanyahu, for what it's worth, has already started this process. He's met with all the faction leaders of the right. And the latest development is that he's very keen to sew this up quickly, to have them all distribute the portfolios, and then worry about the details and the coalition guidelines only afterwards. Shas, Aryeh Deri, his closest partner, has agreed to that process. The others, both religious Zionists and the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox, have said no. They've got certain issues and demands that they've campaigned for. They're probably also kind of aware of Netanyahu's previous form in not perhaps sticking to the word of agreements with coalition partners, and is quite keen for their own sake and their own justifications to get everything hammered out in advance. That's likely now to kind of elongate the process. On November the 15th, the Knesset will be formally sworn in, the new MKs, and Netanyahu is hoping to basically swear in his government at a similar timescale. It now looks like that will take an extra 2 or 3 weeks to nail it down. I won't say too much now about kind of speculation over portfolios, but if that's something people are interested in, I'm happy to expand on that in the questions. So the conventional thinking, and Netanyahu said it a week before the election, that he would go with his natural partners, he would lock them down, and then he would kind of go fishing and try and expand the government with some of the centrist parties. He may even be tempted to hold back some of the juiciest portfolios in a way to tempt perhaps Gantz, for example, into his coalition. I should add to this point that there is also kind of a contrary stream that basically recognizes just how dangerous the idea of having Ben Gvir in the government is, and that I think this movement is starting with Herzog behind the scenes. I don't think we'll see that in the televised consultations, but behind the scenes, Herzog is pushing for both the big centrist parties, Lapid and Gantz, to moderate their position and out of national responsibility, form a national unity government. I think we'll start hearing these issues become more public and louder in the next couple of weeks as people come to terms with the fact that it may well be a Ben Gvir in the government, and we'll have to see if that pressure kind of has any stance. Obviously, Lapid has staked his career until now and recently over the last 5 years as not sitting with Netanyahu, so that would be a huge U-turn on his part. Gantz similarly has been burnt before with the agreement, the rotation agreement that didn't work out, and Netanyahu basically cheated him out of the premiership after having agreed to a rotation. So both are understandably reticent, at least in public, to go forward and do that. But I wouldn't rule it out completely, and maybe this is kind of some naive optimism hanging on to there. But it's still, at least until it's signed and a done deal, theoretically possible. I would add that in favor of that Historically, Netanyahu has always looked towards the center and even the left wing to balance his coalition. As it stands, if he forms this right-wing government, Netanyahu himself will probably be the most left-wing member of the cabinet, and that's hardly a position which is comfortable for him. And so his preference, again, as he's done in the past with Ehud Barak, with Lapid himself, even with Tzipi Livni, and most recently with Gantz, he likes that to balance his own cabinet, and that would be his preference, but he may not be able to this time. Again, for kind of looking for seeds of optimism in terms of that national unity route, it's worth noting that all Netanyahu's public comments until now, since he was successful on election night a week ago, have been relatively conciliatory. He had an opportunity the day before yesterday at the anniversary of the murder of Yitzhak Rabin to kind of to preach those messages of unity and kind of keeping things civil and brotherly within the camps, and looking for what the issues that unite them. So these sort of messages are kind of certainly positive, and we'll have to see if that has any real ramifications. I'll make a few comments on some of the policy issues which are on the agenda, and then I'll pause to take all your questions. First of all, and I don't think you can underestimate this, there are a whole series of what's relatively minor pieces of legislation that the government have passed in the last year and a half that the ultra-Orthodox parties are particularly furious about. I mean, there's real anger and resentment. Ironically, one of the first things they're likely to change, and this might sound a little bit silly or superficial to an outside audience, but there is a strong issue that the outgoing Minister of Finance, Victor Lieberman, placed taxes on disposable cutlery and high sugar content fizzy drinks. This was seen as an affront to the ultra-Orthodox. By the way, the rationale behind this was that disposable cutlery is bad for the environment, so you raise the taxes to disincentivize people from using them. The truth is that the ultra-Orthodox use a disproportionate large amount of disposable cutlery. Some families may use it on a regular basis, and with so many people to feed and often kind of public events, it's often seen. And similarly, the high-sugared fizzy drinks are also kind of a staple in all these ultra-Orthodox events. We're not even talking about Coca-Cola and Fanta. We're talking about the kind of the cheaper brand names, which are even higher in sugar. And again, they were banned and taxed because of health reasons and to stop children consuming them. But this is something that's the ultra-Orthodox are going to be the first to reverse. Some of the other issues, and I'll go through these quickly, in the issue of chametz, taking unleavened food into the hospitals over Passover. The last outgoing government allowed people to bring in, for non-Jews, to bring in chametz and pitot and lafot, etc. That was considered a great affront to the ultra-Orthodox, and they're going to try and prevent that. I happen to know from discussing this with medical practitioners that in most hospitals, this has never been an issue. They kind of apply common sense and understand where there is a population that is sensitive to these things and where they can find leeway. And they always kind of find a very sensible compromise without offending anyone. The hospitals know how to do that. The politicians get involved and kind of politicize it and make it more complicated. The reform on what they call kosher phones, which are basically simple old style Nokia phones that don't have internet connection, which are referred to as kosher phones here. There was a reform in the industry to basically break a monopoly and allow all the phone companies to compete for them. The ultra-Orthodox again misinterpret this as a threat that what they think they're doing now is trying to sell phones with the internet to their kids, which is kind of the main threat of secularization to their lifestyle, and they're very concerned about that. Other issues they don't like: surrogacy for same-sex couples, renewing the ban on conversion therapy. The big one, I suppose, is public transport on Shabbat that has never really come in, but the Labour leader in particular, with the building of the new light railway in Tel Aviv, which is still probably 2 or 3 years away, was discussing running some of those lines on Shabbat. That's certainly not going to happen with this government. And they even kind of, I think this was more of a weather balloon to test the waters, but there was a conversation in the Israeli media today about banning football being played on Shabbat. Lots of people came out against that, claiming that for lots of families and soldiers on leave, this is the only chance they get. The head of the Israel Football Association came out and said, it's quite clear there's no other way to do this on Shabbat. This issue comes up every now and then, every few years in Israeli society. And it's interesting, kind of, as I say, as a political weather balloon to test these things. On security issues, again, I mentioned before, the issue that Ben-Gvir was able to play on his part of his popularity was tapping into the legitimate concerns of lawlessness, lack of governance, crime, especially in the Arab sector, spilling out into Jewish areas, particularly in the periphery, in the Negev and in the Galil, playing on the real terror threats that we've seen kind of spike again this year. The problem is that if you look back to May 21, where we had the riots in the inner cities, the police actually blamed Ben-Gvir himself being the pyrotechnic. He was the one, if you remember the sequencing of events, set up his office in Sheikh Jarrah, claiming that he was there to protect the Jews who were close to Shimon HaTzadik grave. But it basically has exacerbated tension there. He went to the Damascus Gate. He is one of the big campaigners about Jewish prayer rights on the Temple Mount, which is perhaps the most sensitive and toxic issue. And again, I'll say a word in kind of the moderation of Netanyahu, that for his whole duration while he was prime minister, he would never accept any change from the 1967 status quo. He was quite clear that Muslims pray on the Mount, non-Muslims visit the Mount. There has been an erosion over the last 2 or 3 years, not from government policy, but just from activism. And Ben-Gvir is part of that camp, which is also which Israel is looking very is very concerned that he is going to try and change, especially if he becomes the minister in question, that he's going to kind of challenge that status quo, and that will put him at I would say loggerheads with Netanyahu as well, who understands the toxic significance. Other issues kind of on the agenda, we can talk about foreign policy again. I'll just kind of flag issues up that you can ask me about, but all sorts of Israeli foreign relations achievements made in the last couple of years, particularly with Jordan and with Turkey, the extension of the Abraham Accords morphing into the Negev Summit. These things will be very interesting to see how they develop in the future government. And the final issue I would talk about is perhaps one of the most important and will be the weather vane for this government, is the legal issue. There are a range of legal reforms on the agenda. The most serious and threatening to Israeli democracy, if we can speak in those terms, and as you can hear, I'm trying to be careful and calibrated, but is what's referred to in English as the override law. This is the ability for Israel doesn't have a constitution, we have a separation of powers, and that if a law goes against one of the basic laws that Israel has established, passed by a special majority in the Knesset, then it can be overturned on review by the High Court. There is long-term animosity particularly from the ultra-Orthodox community, but also obviously within religious Zionism against the current makeup of the legal system. And if they pass a system which allows the override law to take over by a simple majority, then this is kind of a huge erosion of the separation of powers and the balance and the balance of powers of the High Court. Similar issues related to the way that you select judges. At the moment, there is a selection committee of 9 people made up of 4 politicians, 2 from the government, 2 from the opposition, 2 members of the Israeli Bar Association, and 3 existing judges. It needs a qualifying 6 or 7 out of 9 to approve appointments, and basically want to up the quota of the politicians to give the politicians more of a say on that. That's also considered problematic. There are other issues, and by the way, all of the whole issue of the override law, one of the main long-term concerns of the ultra-Orthodox is the issue about the induction of their boys into the army, and kind of what's referred to here amongst the secular community is the equal sharing of the burden. If they're able to pass the override law, then there's nothing stopping them to pass a very simple law that says every 18-year-old goes into the army, except those that learn in religious seminaries. And that's the law. At the moment, that sort of law has been blocked because it doesn't reach the threshold, according to the High Court, on stands of equality. If you take away that ability, then you're allowed to pass any sorts of laws. And the final kind of notion of laws packages, which some of Netanyahu's partners are suggesting to do, basically are various creative ways to end the trial of Netanyahu. As you'll be aware, he's on 3 counts of fraud and breach of trust, and it's the breach of trust categorization of that crime, which is ambiguous, which some legal scholars have also recommended changing and altering. But if it gets cancelled, that would automatically cancel every case that has been tried under that criteria would then be quashed and dropped. So it's a very easy, elegant way, not so elegant perhaps, it's quite blatant, but an easy way to end Netanyahu's trial. At the moment, again, Netanyahu is being far more circumspect and careful. He claims, at least publicly, that he's not endorsing that approach and that's not his preferred option. But again, he's got his partners pushing for that. And so their insistence on these issues, especially the override law. And by the way, when it comes to partial, and I encourage you all to be very careful and look out for the details, because there are some versions of the override law, if, by the way, they categorize it that it needs a special majority in the Knesset or a special majority even in the High Court amongst a panel of judges, that's not so bad. That's kind of, even according to some kind of moderate reformers, is kind of a necessary tweak to the system. So it shouldn't be kind of all is lost. But if it becomes a simple majority or just a 61 majority, then that's kind of where the danger zone is. So there is nuance there. There is concern and detail, but there are a lot of people that are very, very concerned about that. I'll pause there and I welcome any questions.